This oral history of museum computing is provided by Darren Milligan and was recorded on the 19th of March, 2021 by Paul Marty and Kathy Jones.
So I guess I'll start maybe right now and kind of work my way backwards a little bit. So I'm very recently the acting director of the Smithsonian Center for Learning and Digital Access, and prior to December was the director of a project called the Smithsonian Learning Lab, and the sort of my official title was Senior Digital Strategist at the Center for Learning and Digital Access. So I'm still with the same department within the Smithsonian, but now in more of a leadership position. But the center really exists to ensure that folks who are in what we would describe as, I suppose, the educational ecosystem or the educational community have the right level of access and the right tools to make use of the digital resources from across the Smithsonian's sort of umbrella. So the center exists specifically to serve an educational capacity for the Smithsonian, but not within the context of the museum itself. And so, I mean, I think that's part of the story that I was excited a bit to tell all of you is, I often feel like I don't work at a museum because we're really engaged with what happens with museum knowledge and museum objects and assets, but outside of the context of the museum exhibition experience, the museum collection experience. And that's has its own set of unique challenges and own set of unique sort of possibilities. But I've been at the Smithsonian for 15 and a half years. So when I came into the Smithsonian from outside the museum space, and so my undergraduate degree is in an undergraduate degree in Spanish, sort of focusing on Latin American popular culture, and undergraduate degree in biology, focusing on ethology and evolution. And my first sort of job out of college was working at a nonprofit that did research on migratory birds and did some public education, some public outreach, and some public engagement. And I got that job because I had some experience in biology and I was doing some fieldwork assistance and some other things in some of the traditional patterns. But this was the late 90s, and so this organization was really interested in connecting, and communicating and growing their base. Because they were nonprofit, they relied on product sales and on membership to sustain the scientific work. And so I was sort of the young person who had the most comfort level or confidence level, I suppose, with technology and with computers. And so the directive came down of, figure out how to build a website and figure out how to create an online shopping cart. And, and I think this is a similar story for most people that I know, and sort of my generation at museums and elsewhere, that you couldn't go to school for these things in the 90s yet, and you just sort of learned how to do it. You looked at the source code and you figured out, you saw something cool on someone else's website and you looked at the source code and you figured out how they did it, and you copied it and modified it and taught yourself HTML and JavaScript and all the things you needed to do to be able to make things happen in your end. And so slowly my job became less about biology and less about animal behavior and a lot more about technology and about building sites. And ultimately, once we really had a more of a robust site, it was then about how do we use those tools to really engage with our community. And so right when I was sort of leaving that organization, I was building some tools for sort of mentorship, actually creating a mentorship program where people who were more involved in the sort of conservation side of this work, and people who are newly coming into this, and creating citizen science sort of data collection tools so that people could report migration patterns. And that's, I think, I was sort of on my way out of that organization at the time, but that's when things really started getting much more interesting. It was really sort of the beginning of more of a back and forth sort of, Web 2.0, or sort of more participatory way of using those digital tools to connect, an organization with a really, really wide group of enthusiasts and individuals. So then I left all that behind, and the unfortunate thing was that nonprofit was in my hometown where I grew up in northwestern Pennsylvania, and really didn't want to be in my hometown as a recent college graduate, and wanted, to do something different. And so I moved to Pittsburgh and started working in corporate marketing and digital communications. And so I worked for a software company, sort of the .com era, very exciting, lots of young people, lots of money to do all kinds of interesting things, big teams of writers and creative people and technologists and video people, and really focused, exclusively on doing, email marketing design, web development, really, but very much outside of that nonprofit space, but really in a much faster paced, much sort of very, very different environment, and worked there for a number of years. But I think realized, having had that nonprofit experience, that there was that sort of, I think, that kind of mission driven fulfillment that we probably, the three of us collectively have, and most people working in the field sort of have, was really missing. And so moved to Washington, D.C., really to work at a very similar company, another software company, but moved here knowing this was sort of the headquarters for a lot of nonprofits, a lot of museums, and just knowing I kind of wanted to get back into that space. And so somehow I was able to make my way into a federal job application at the Smithsonian, knowing really very little about that. And it's kind of shocking to me that I even sort of got an interview at this point. I think, the office I was applying to was at the time called the Center for Education and Museum Studies. And it's in a sense the same office that I'm leading now, but in a very different sort of era. The Smithsonian's had an office like this. This is actually the 50th anniversary of this office. It really began, though, as the Office of Secondary Education. The Smithsonian had a very significant museum studies program, museum studies department in this era, in the 70s, that I think fulfilled a lot of the roles that like AAM and some other organizations fulfill now. We maintained a lot of resources on college programs for museum studies, publication opportunities. It was sort of a clearinghouse. So I think the Smithsonian was playing a bit more of a kind of a leadership role as sort of the national sort of museum infrastructure space in there. And at some point in the 70s, that those two organizations were sort of smashed together into this office called the Center for Education and Museum Studies. And so it was three things. It was a museum educational publishing department. It was a teacher professional development program, and it was this museum studies program. And I sort of came into that sort of world, but in the publishing end. And so at the time when I came in, I was hired as, my title was just webmaster. I think probably many of us have had that title at one point, but it was really brought in to take care of some existing, web properties that the center ran. One was the Museum Studies program's website. We ran the internship program for the Smithsonian, and we had sort of a portal that was very new when I came. It just launched when I joined. It was called SmithsonianEducation.org, which was sort of the central place for families or for teachers for the Smithsonian. So very much at that sort of Smithsonian level, not at the individual, kind of what we would call a unit level museum or research center or library archive. And it was really, it was a database of about 500 lesson plans, I think, from across the institution that were available digitally. And that was sort of our education outreach tool, I guess I would say. A big part of what we did was publish something called Smithsonian in Your Classroom, which was a printed magazine. It went to every elementary and middle school in the country. So we were mailing between 80 and 100,000 of these out twice a year, which was seems insane to me now. The amount of paper and postage and they were beautifully designed. They were usually like 20, 25 page teacher magazines that included background information for the classroom teacher, usually 1 to 3 activities, some extension activities. Oftentimes it would feature a Smithsonian expert who was involved in that area, but we worked across the Smithsonian. So we might do an issue on whale migration, and then the next one would be on Native American doll beadwork. It was sort of very kind of broad and spectrum. So part of what I was doing was sort of art directing and managing that while sort of taking on the sort of webmaster sort of roles. And that really continued. I think that was pretty kind of straight for quite a while. That was what this, we referred to ourselves as the central education office for the Smithsonian. And so while each of, obviously, the museums had their own education departments, they primarily focused on, being at the Smithsonian, the thousands or tens of thousands of people coming through the door every day and, working on programming for families or for school groups. A very, very small percentage of their time was dedicated to sort of online or outreach or the people who were not being served by the museum. It was very much focused on the museum visitor. The educator's job was on the floor, was really in that museum space at the time. And so really we were the ones sort of tasked with anything online was sort of more or less our responsibility, with some exceptions, of course, because the Smithsonian's a big place. I think about, let's see, about 8 or 9 years ago, 8 years ago, since that Smithsonianeducation.org website, which had launched, I believe, in 2003, was starting to age pretty significantly, in terms of its user experience, but also I think in terms of kind of what we were publishing and how we were publishing. And much of what was there were PDF versions of the Smithsonian in Your Classroom magazine, and similar from other parts of the Smithsonian. And I sort of had, from my leadership, kind of a mandate of like, well, we need to redesign this and create a better user experience, and so figure out how to how what we need to do that. And I think pretty quickly I've sort of realized, kind of with a lot of terror, that I didn't know how to do that, because we knew so little about who our users were, right? I mean, I think the site had launched 10 years previous. We could see what was being downloaded, or Google Analytics sort of data about usage, but what does a teacher do in a classroom with a PDF of a 25-page magazine that's about whale migration? Like, what is she actually doing? What does that actually look like? And how do we make that better? How do we improve that? And so we somehow, I'm like, I think I have a fog over this in my memory, because I think I was really terrified at the time. I kind of had to go to my leadership and say, we can't do this. Like, we don't know enough about what our role is, or who our users are, or how they use digital museum content. How do they use these kinds of lesson plans to be able to create anything that would be good, that would actually be more than just an improvement of the user experience. I think, I said, yeah, we can make a more up-to-date database of, at this point, I think we had about 2,000 lesson plans sort of cataloged there. They were all aligned to national standards. It was good for what it was, but it was a text database of metadata describing lesson plans. So that really sort of stopped that project, and kind of made us quickly kind of gear up to be more of a research and evaluation department, to try to figure out. It first started out, what's the website be? But it really, I think, started to answer two questions, not just what's the user experience we should be connecting, what are our user experience expectations for teachers in the classroom from a place like the Smithsonian, but also the content. What should we be publishing, and how should we be publishing it in a way that is useful to them? And I think and this was a sort of a series of sort of 5 studies that were done over the course of several years to define our audience, and then to really dig into that actual process of what teachers do with digital museum learning content. And I think one of the first focus groups, it was a series of different things, and some of it was quantitative, a lot of it was qualitative, looking at the actual experience of teachers who were using our material. And it was sort of astonishing. It was like 98% of users were not using the material in the ways that we had published it. This is sort of looking at like that Smithsonian in Your Classroom, and they, when we would connect with people who were using it, they'd say, oh yeah, we love that. I cut out the map that you had on the second page, and I like blew that up from my bulletin board. And we'd be like, oh, okay, well, what about the lesson that went with the map? And they're like, oh yeah, I don't think I read that. Or, like they were reading the background essay to sort of bring themselves up to speed, because they were introducing a topic the next day, but that's all they needed. They didn't need the lessons, they didn't need the activities. Or the activity took 2 class periods and they had 20 minutes. And so they would adapt it to make it work in the period of time. So, what we were publishing was useful to them, but we were publishing it as a PDF, on a website that you had to know to go to, and you had to know how to find. We were making it, almost as difficult as we possibly could to allow for that kind of customization and flexibility and sort of mashup behavior that we were, quickly seeing was typical teacher behavior for how they create lessons. And, then we were looking at other sort of on these sort of user experience side, sort of what was that looking like? And this was a time where there were a lot of kind of ed tech startups really beginning to really surface and build some market share. And we're beginning to build the kinds of tools that I think we were starting to picture in our own minds about what we want our teachers to be able to do with these things. And you know, this was still sort of 7 years ago, I guess. And, the Smithsonian at the time, we were not open access participants. We were very strict with the usage of our digital materials. And, I remember at the time thinking, man, if we could just get our millions of images into these other external platforms that already have teacher communities of hundreds of thousands, it would be amazing. We would see the results of that. And that wasn't possible legally based on, how we saw, the sort of copyright or the kind of usage restrictions of our materials. And so what we started to learn is that we needed to build some sort of infrastructure that would sit on top of our digital content that would enable this kind of flexible creation, but it would be our tool, so it could sort of not get in the way of sort of issues around copyright and usage. And I think looking back on it from today, we would never sort of build our own tool. I mean, I think obviously the Smithsonian's we have close to 4 million images now that are CC0. I mean, the institution has changed a lot in terms of its thinking, but it was at the point where we were really beginning to understand what teachers would want from a place like museums, like the Smithsonian. To design that system, we did over the course of a summer 6 years ago. We had teachers coming to Washington, D.C. for a week-long teacher sort of professional development experiences. And this is something the Smithsonian's done for a very long time, where teachers come from all over. They spend a week in Washington, D.C. They go to 3 or 4 museums behind the scenes and work with our education teams on using primary sources in their teaching or using museum resources, in the classroom. And we carved out an hour or two every day at the beginning of their day over the course of 3 or 4 weeks to work on this problem, on this idea. And we had, through some of the previous research, we had kind of come up with some paper prototype ideas of what maybe this kind of experience should be like. And so at the beginning of every day, we worked with them on this idea. And we, meaning the staff at the Center for Learning and Digital Access, but also our external partners who were our research and development partners. And so we had software engineers in the room. We had former sort of educators who were now our sort of ed tech research partners in the room. And so, we would hear feedback from teachers on a Tuesday morning about a sort of a paper prototype we were working with. And on Wednesday morning, they would get a new version of that prototype. Our team would sort of do this experience in the morning and then spend the rest of the day re-engineering everything. And as we moved through that experience, we created a sort of a digital prototype of this. And so again, a teacher would say, oh, this is great, but the button was so small, I couldn't see it. The next day, the button would be a lot bigger, so we were able to iterate on a daily basis over and over and over and over again. So it really enabled us by the end of that summer to have something that had been tested, by hundreds of teachers who had gone through, 20 rounds of iteration, and really helped us define, what a sort of a digital toolkit would look like that would really be in line with, a lot of sort of teacher input and a lot of realities of teaching. And so, it was I think, from my perspective of my kind of story, I kind of went from someone who kind of learned how to do some HTML to someone who was really not a web developer or webmaster, but really a software project manager, software product manager, which is very different. So different, I think, I think, I think this has sort of happened. I've seen this, and to kind of my delight. I think there's a core of sort of webmasters, the people who were webmasters at the Smithsonian when I started. Many of them are still here, and all of us were such generalists. I think 15 years ago we had to be. We were probably taking the photographs that were on the webpage, we're editing the photographs, we were probably writing most of the content, editing the content, coding the pages, launching the pages, sometimes taking care of the servers. You were a team of one in many ways, and I think what's been sort of wonderful, I think, as our digital teams have grown and there's been more emphasis in funding and resources for outreach and for online platforms, is to see the sort of specialization. I think I think I've had the opportunity to really dive deeply into education, while others have dived into scientific research or in other areas of sort of more deeper specialization, which which is not a reality, 15 years ago when we were all teens of one. But so anyway, so about 6 years ago, we had this sort of prototype, this idea, and we built this thing called the Smithsonian Learning Lab, which is really a set of exactly what we, had set out to build, which is a tool that encourages the use of all of our stuff by a somewhat specialized audience. And so we're coming up this summer, actually launched 5 years ago in June. Our 5-year anniversary will be this summer in June. We have about 120,000 registered users on the site, and our users have made 40,000. You can think of them as lesson plans, but we call them Learning Lab collections. They're, the site encourages aggregation of individual museum objects, uploading of material from outside of the Smithsonian, layering on of annotation or an assessment, sort of building some sort of experience and sort of package. And so we've had 40,000 of those have been made by users all over the world, who are primarily educators in that sort of educational ecosystem, but not exclusively. And so we're kind of at this period now, I think, of where it's been a tool that was really designed for classroom teachers, and that's beginning to expand as we continue to explore how teachers use this material. And and it turns out, I think one of the big assumptions we made when we were developing the tool and choosing our target audience is that teachers were the best audience for this. And we realized that teachers, primarily for issues of time, are not the best suited all the time for sort of content creation. They're great adapters and modifiers, which we saw, in the beginning when they were doing that with scissors. But it's people like librarians and curriculum specialists, curriculum designers who already are in that space of making things from scratch and building things that suit the needs of teachers in their school or in their district. And so our audience types have continued to kind of bubble out and expand. We're now at a moment, I think, in the past year, partially because of COVID, but not exclusively, where many of the users that we focus on are internal. So the museums themselves, we have 48 different Smithsonian divisions who are currently using the Learning Lab as one of their exclusive platform for educational outreach. So that's been a big change too, because obviously museum educators' needs are really different. They're using it as a publishing tool, very much designed to create something very sort of polished and published for teacher use, where teachers, many of them aren't building things with the idea of publishing them. They're really just creating things for themselves to use with students or with their classroom. So we're doing kind of this sort of balance now as we think about users both on an internal and external space. And the Smithsonian, with our new secretary, Dr. Lonnie Bunch, is, I think, rebranding is probably too light of a way to think about it. I think recentering the Smithsonian's mission as an educational institution. I think he is articulating and will continue to articulate one of the greatest potentials that the Smithsonian has to have in our country at kind of a very troubled time is having an impact in schools and having an impact, with teachers and the students. And so I think we're seeing this moment too, where the Learning Lab, which was designed as really just a kind of a tool to interact with our digitized content, will really become a platform for broader connection with educational audiences for the entire Smithsonian. Which is, we've seen that as the divisions have begun to use it as a tool for outreach, but I think that's going to really go quite a bit deeper, as the mission of the institution is really about having an impact really with teachers and students everywhere. I mean, the secretary has, if he hasn't done it publicly, I think he has articulated publicly that, he wants the Smithsonian to be in every classroom in the country. He wants it to be, one of the handful of places that teachers instantly think about as a place for quality information, knowledge, resources, experiences. And I think museum educators, especially those who kind of work in the technology space, we're constantly battling this idea that the public has, that museums, especially to a teacher, to an education space, or even to a family, really, that museums are events, that they're very much experiences. They're a thing to do, but not necessarily a resource for kind of knowledge. The Smithsonian has everyone at the Smithsonian hates this, but it's like a lot of people think of this and this is actually something I think we came up with and we're using, in the I think it was in the 70s. This year is our 175th anniversary of the Smithsonian, and it may have been around the 150th. We were talking about ourselves as the nation's attic. And that was just something kind of, we thought that was kind of a catchy, clever sort of thing, I think. And I think we all hate that now because, an attic is where you put stuff you don't need. It's a place you don't quite want to throw it away, but you don't need it every day. And I think that's the opposite of what we aspire to be, is that it is something we could be something that you need and use every day. And so I think we're trying to shift that nation's attic to more of the idea of the nation's memory, this place that you're recalling and using to make decisions that you're using to inform your sort of day-to-day. So I mean, that kind of brings us up. I mean, for the last 5 years, we've been running Learning Lab, continuing to really evolve at doing, continuing that sort of research and evaluation perspective of working with our users to understand their needs now. And that means both internal users and external users, building new tools, building supports that enable other types of users to take a greater advantage of the resources that are available there. So my role has really gone from somebody who's, stealing HTML snippets from other websites to try to build things, to managing a system that I understand how it works, but I cannot, my skill set is nowhere capable of being able to fix or change things. I mean, it's leading a team of, of 10 or 15 people who have very specific technical expertise around managing the code for this very complex and growingly complex piece of software. So I'll pause there for a second.
Yeah, we spoke last week with Scott Sayer. Do you remember Scott?
Yeah, I know Scott. Yeah.
And he told some of his memories about the early days of working with Arts Connected, right? With Mia and the Walker,
Yeah.
right? It's wonderful to see this historical progression, right? To look at all of these resources for education. And he actually told a similar story about working with teachers and doing some user testing with teachers. I was just wondering, so what was your relationship like with the teachers? Do you still work with them? How do you build that connection?
Yeah, it's good. And Arts Connected was one of our, part of our initial work was doing a fairly extensive literature review and environmental scan of both sort of museum, but also non-museum kind of platforms. And they were certainly high on our list and really something we built upon. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, most of our user feedback comes from sort of teacher professional development programs. Unfortunately, many of those are sort of one and done sort of experiences, especially, the ones where they would sort of come for a week, and typically they were coming to a specific museum. And so in the case of that sort of week after week piece, those weren't professional development workshops that our center was running. They were being run by the Smithsonian American Art Museum or the National Museum of African Art. In that circumstance, the funding that paid for those experiences, for bureaucratic reasons more than anything, had sort of funneled through our office. And so we were in this kind of position to sort of tell the museums, look, we're going to take an hour a day of your workshop, okay, to sort of do this digital thing. The rest of the day, we won't be there. It's your program. And so those museums typically had the relationships. There are a couple more contemporary examples where those relationships sort of fell away. I think, we had this experience and we worked with them, and we certainly, when we launched the platform, we reached out to them to let them know that their input had a significant influence on the tool. The Smithsonian American Art Museum and the National Portrait Gallery do these same experiences and continued, doing them every summer. And even last summer, continued to do them sort of in a digital, and we'll again this summer do them in a digital format. But historically, those workshops culminated sort of on the Friday or beyond, with each participant creating a lesson plan that they would then take back and use in their classroom, and there'd be a tangible result. About 4 years ago, both of those museums shifted to Learning Lab being the tool for them for the participants to create something. And so what's kind of incredible now is that, they have this connection with those users, and they have hundreds of these Learning Lab collections that have come out of these experiences that are, they're for the most part really fantastic, because they've been guided by museum educators for a whole week. They're also teachers who are opting in to have this experience. And so they're highly motivated sort of teachers who are coming to Washington and kind of having this experience, are really into using museum objects already. And they're now part of this kind of cohort of sort of alumni, of people who have participated in this, that have created this body of work that the museum uses with fundraising. I mean, they can go to the funders who support these professional development weeks and say, here's these hundreds of amazing things that are now published and freely available on the Smithsonian's platform. Other teachers are using them, they're teaching with them. There's this much more sort of tangible, visible output of these things. I think, much of what happens on Learning Lab, I think, was happening before. I mean, but it was happening on a teacher's PowerPoint on her laptop. It was happening in spaces that were just invisible. They were happening in classrooms. And what's so powerful, I think, now is that it's happening on something, we own. We can stand behind the scenes and we can sort of see what's happening. We can begin to understand how, teachers take advantage of these materials. And I think it's really shifted. And I think it will continue to shift. We have a PhD student who's just coming on board right now, helping us look specifically at how teachers build, or how users of the Learning Lab build these collections, and sort of what that kind of looks like. And I think it's been part of a shift we didn't really talk about yet, but I think part of the change I've seen in museum education, since, in sort of my 15 years, I guess, in the museum world, has been this big shift towards user-centered, or being responsive to user needs. I think, much of what we were doing with that Smithsonian in Your Classroom magazine was, the National Museum of Natural History is opening the Ocean Hall. Okay, well, in coordination with that, we'll do an issue on whale migration that helps promote the opening of this hall. It was very much driven by the sort of museum identifying what we thought was valuable, to sort of what knowledge was valuable and was shareable and was important for people to know. And not that has gone away, but I think what we've learned is that especially in the education space, especially in the education outreach space, is that if you want to have an impact with a large number of people, you need to give them more of what they are looking for. You need to help them. You need to identify the things that they can't find elsewhere, or they're struggling to teach or to work with their students on. And so I think we've seen that. And I think as museum education departments have evolved to focus a little bit more on sort of the national impact, or the national outreach, versus just the in-person experience, there's been this big shift in kind of the museum educator. I think, the way that it was sort of described to me coming into the museum world was that the museum educator sort of interprets the exhibitions for families, or for school groups. They're the middleman between the sort of expert and sort of the public, I guess, is, I think, and it seems terrible to me now, because I mean, most of the educators I know are so expert at the things that they do that it's a minimization, I guess, of minimizing a way of describing what they do. And I think so much more of it now is understanding teachers, understanding the classroom, understanding what the Smithsonian may uniquely be able to help teachers do. And it's not the thing we want them to do, it's the thing that they know they need to do, or the thing that they know that their students need access to. And we might be uniquely positioned to connect with that and to explain that, to be the provider of that. And that's a big transition. I think one that maybe hasn't been talked about a lot, about that sort of change in how educators approach their work. And I think we see that now, where educators, at the Smithsonian are on exhibition teams, and they weren't. When I started, there weren't any educators that were on exhibition teams. They were brought in at the last week before the exhibition opened and said, "Oh, can you make a lesson plan about this?" kind of, I mean, they were sort of an afterthought, or that sort of translator role. But that's for the most part, at least at the Smithsonian perspective, and that's changed a lot. I think the role of educator as leader, as sort of the voice in the room, is really significantly grown. And I can't imagine that's going to not grow further, at least in the Smithsonian context, with the focus on education from our leadership.
Well, it's a lot of key philosophical shifts happening at once.
Yeah,
Right?
I think
This
so.
idea that what was an inside museum experience is an outside museum experience. What was a one-way interaction is now a two-way interaction, right?
Yeah.
And you've lived through that whole development.
Yeah, which was, I mean, and also, I mean, a highly contextualized experience, an exhibition, a linear experience you're moving through to here. We have 6 million digitized objects online right now in the Learning Lab, which are contextualized in the context of how users have created them and added them into collections and created their own context. And some of those users are museum contextualizations. They're museum, about 20% of our published collections are created by Smithsonian staff. But you're not, but the rest of it is all these individual objects and their metadata records, which, can be up to 175 years old, which is a whole different sort of slew of issues and kind of, but yeah, I mean, I think, which I think our secretary is right in thinking that we have great potential to be a source and not just this experience, and not to, I mean, I love museums and I love going to museums. And I think, that it's not to sort of separate or to take away from that, but to sort of elevate the places that we can have an impact.
Well, back in the day, we used to talk about this as shifting from the visitor in the life of the museum to the museum in the life of the visitor.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Yeah. I think that still holds up. Yeah. I mean, I think that's very much figuring out. And I think that, I think the educators are the ones who are at least experienced and positioned to help that grow, or to help that sort of have some hope for that actually working.
Well, this is absolutely brilliant. I mean, I think we've maybe reached kind of a natural pause point right here. I don't know, Kathy, do you have any questions?
Sorry, it took me a minute to unmute. I don't. I'm just fascinated by this. I'm still stuck on what would the teacher do when they got the 25-page PDF.
Yeah. I mean, it was even worse than that, Kathy. I mean, it was like, one issue, they would go to the library typically of the school. And, so one issue would be meant for a biology teacher. The next would be meant for like, an English language arts teacher. So it wasn't even like each issue had sort of continuity with who its recipient was. And so you had to have an amazing librarian who would get it and go, this is for, Mrs. Simpson, and take it. And then Mrs. Simpson would have to go, oh, this is great. I'm going to use it in an already jammed lesson, plan, or an already stressed environment where they're trying to meet, the needs of standardized testing and all the other sort of stressors that teachers have put on them. So it was, the chances of success were so small. And we would mail these things out and sort of high five and be like, all right, what's the next issue? We got to get another one out, in 5 months. Like it disappeared, and what's so incredible about, and they're not apples and apples necessarily, but sort of the Learning Lab collection as the equivalent of that, is that, we can see exactly how many people looked at it. We can see if it was assigned to a roster of students. We can see if it was copied and adapted by another user. Like we're buried under the kind of data that we have versus, the 0 points of data that we had, with the sort of printed version of this idea.
Or the anger that the librarian had when they cut out that map.
Right, returned it back. Piece cut out. I'm sure that happened.
Also, this was happening at an era when school librarians were losing their jobs left and right as that was being written out. Right?
Very, very much. Yeah. So I mean, that when we started to the last couple issues, we stopped publishing that. I guess 7 years ago. The last 2 or 3 issues, we experimented with creating sort of a sort of student-centered digital interactive version of whatever the lessons were. And so, we would create like a simulation or almost a game. They weren't quite games technically, but and those were super popular, but they were also extremely expensive. And and it was the same sort of issue of connecting with the right audience, the right user. I mean, it was just put out online in a sea of a million other kind of similar things, and that it just was not a sustainable activity, despite how sort of charming and wonderful those were to create and work on. They just weren't. We no longer had, well, I should say, not that we were asked before, we didn't have the data to support sustaining them anymore. I mean, I think we were moving also to an era where we had to be more accountable, for the budget that we had, I mean, I think especially, it's very unique to have an office focused exclusively on educational outreach at a museum, a museum infrastructure. So I think that there was more pressure on our center to justify its existence. And I think to sort of say, oh, we mailed out 80,000 magazines, last week. I mean, that's like, oh, okay, great. Well, did children's lives change, or did, are teachers giving money to the Smithsonian now? Or like, what was the actual kind of impact of that from the student or from the institutional level? And we couldn't answer those questions without extensive evaluations or other kind of longer term investigations.
That's what I find so positive, I guess, maybe even uplifting about the Smithsonian's vision, right? I talked to Diane Zorich about this not too long ago, Effie Capsalis, right? Everybody's on board with this idea of the Smithsonian making a difference in people's lives, regardless of whether or not they can come to DC, right?
Mhm.
And it sounds like this vision's coming top down. The Secretary Bunch is on board, and you, as an institution, you're focused on that.
I would say that's true. I mean, I think, that's been the shift, I think, with the secretary. I mean, all the people you mentioned, and quite a few more, have been pushing this for this idea of investing in digital and all the ways that all the things that means, lays the groundwork for us to have a greater impact. And I think most of us who work there feel like, I mean, assume that that's possible, I think, right? Or optimistic that we have a role to play, or that access to what we have, or kind of what we know here, is crucial to democracy, or crucial to healthy citizenship, or crucial to cultural well-being and satisfaction and joy and all the kinds of things I think that all of us sort of have drunk the Kool-Aid on, and I think, so there's been this sort of, I think, bottom-up push for quite a while of, people really making the case for that, building the evidence for that. And I think, Lonnie, having come from our world, understanding our institution, spending his career here, has heard that and sees that. And I think feels like we're at a moment probably where he thinks it's possible. I mean, I think because he understands how, where we are in our course of sort of evolution as an institution, this is the moment where he thinks it's worth articulating that, because I think he sees that it's possible, which is really, I mean, it's pretty exciting, to be there at that moment.
And that optimism is, both inspiring and contagious. I was just writing some letters of reference, I guess it was last month, for some students who are applying for the internship programs at the Smithsonian, right? And I'm seeing this in the students' personal statements that they're sharing with me. That vision, right? It appeals to the students who are trying to do this, who want a career in this.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we were all ecstatic when the announcement was made, of Lonnie becoming the secretary. I mean, he was very well loved institutionally, but to know, to have a historian, to have a museum director, to have someone who represents so much sort of change, and at the right time and the right moment, I think was so, I think, inspiring to many of us. I think to sort of say this is going to mean really good things for our whole field. This isn't just just symbolically a really great choice for right now. It's, he's an incredible person and an incredible sort of leader, and I think is willing to articulate that kind of vision that, that we all want to be part of, that we all want. I think because we work in this space, we want there to be that sort of driving mission.
I think
Beyond
it
just the mission statement.
inspires the whole field. you know, because he is a museum person. So there was probably both a sigh of relief and an exhale of joy.
Mhm. Yeah, no, very much. It was, and I think, he was my fourth secretary, I think. That's right.
Mm.
And the first secretary when I started the Smithsonian sort of left in shame and disgrace after a lot of financial issues. And the secretary right before Dr. Bunch was not a museum person. He was a great guy, but he was, he was a physician and he was a university leader, had sort of come out of university leadership, which seemed to, I think, to a lot of people make sense. It's like, well, the Smithsonian's sort of like a university, and has similar, human resources issues and system issues and all of that. But I think that such a stark contrast with with Lonnie, is that museum experience, that sort of deep passion for, in Lonnie's case, for history and for our culture, and and for the role that having a knowledge of your history and your culture can mean to you as a citizen, as a human, um, is tangible.